Hi there, so I received a few questions on my trip to the Amalfi Coast. So I decided to make a little video addressing everything that you need to know before traveling to the Amalfi Coast. So I'll be discussing cost, budget, where to stay, where to eat, what activities to do, and also what little towns to visit. So I hope this video is going to be helpful. If it is, don't forget to give it a thumbs up and subscribe to my channel. And leave a little comment below if you have more questions or you'd like me to do these kinds of videos for any other places that I've been. And if you're new to my channel, I've traveled a lot in the last few months and I've vlogged those trips, so if you're interested you can go to my channel and watch those videos. Okay, so to start, I thought I would give you a little bit of background on this trip. I went to Italy this summer with one of my friends and the Amalfi Coast was part of our trip. Actually, it was the end of our trip, so we also visited Naples and Sorrento as well before going to the Amalfi Coast, and we stayed there for a few days. If I remember correctly, we stayed for 5 days. So the first thing to address is how you're going to get there. So for us, we flew from Montreal to Naples because that was our first city that we visited, and we had a layover in Paris. But I think that if I had to do it over again, I would fly from Montreal to Rome instead of to Naples, just because it's a direct flight, so it's a lot shorter and a lot cheaper. So I think it's worth kind of comparing different cities that you will land to, because prices can change. But also it's important to know that most of the time when you're able to fly to and fly from the same city, it's a lot cheaper than if you select different cities. So for example, if you do Montreal, Naples, Naples, Montreal, it's going to be cheaper than if you do, for example, Montreal, Rome, and let's say Naples, Montreal. So if you plan to do a trip in Italy and visit different cities, if you're able to stay close to the same airport, it's a way to save cost, but it's also fun to see more cities. So it depends what you want to do and what's your budget. But I thought I would mention that just to give you a little heads up and an idea of something to look for. So once you're in Italy, you're going to want to go to the Amalfi Coast, and there's a few ways to get to the Amalfi Coast. You can take a taxi, you can rent a car, you can go by bus, or you can take a ferry. Taking taxis on the Amalfi Coast is really expensive, so it's not really something that I would suggest. Also, buses are usually the cheapest alternative, so that's what we did, just because we thought it would be easier, which definitely wasn't. In retrospective, I think we should have taken the ferry, even though it's a little bit more expensive. That's what we were recommended to do, but at the time we thought it would be more complicated, which I really don't think it was, because going to the Amalfi Coast by bus was definitely really stressful. In our trip we did Naples, Sorrento, and Amalfi Coast. So when we wanted to go to the Amalfi Coast, we were at that time in Sorrento, so we had to take the bus from Sorrento to the Amalfi Coast, and the bus was full. We had to wait a few buses before we could actually get into the bus, and it was really chaotic because whenever a bus arrived, everyone would just rush to the door without following the line. So we just had to kind of push around everyone to get a place, and we had all of our luggage because we were planning to stay a few days on the Amalfi Coast, so we had to carry our luggage. So overall, really stressful. And then we were unable to stop at our bus stop where we should have gotten out of the bus to go to our hotel, because there were so many people like in the bus blocking our way. So we had to continue all the way at the end of the line, which was in Amalfi, and we were staying just a little bit before Amalfi, and take another bus, which was a little bit less crowded, thankfully, to actually go back to our hotel. So it was a little bit complicated. So I just wanted to put that out there. You can take the bus if you want because it's cheaper, but I really think that the ferry is a more efficient way of getting to the Amalfi Coast. Okay, so now another really important thing to discuss is where you're going to stay, so where your hotel should be located. So I think a lot of tourists want to stay either in Positano or in Amalfi, but I think that if you're on a budget, you should stay away from those places just because they're really touristy. So they're going to be super expensive, and it's not necessarily the best location if you want to visit a few towns. And also, if you do plan to visit a few towns, it's not necessary to switch hotels from one town to the other because they're really close together and there isn't much to do in each of these towns. So I think it's better to find a hotel location that is central to the activities or the towns you plan to visit, and then each day go from there to where you want to spend the day and then come back to the hotel, just because you're going to waste so much time moving around from one hotel to the other and you're not really going to gain anything more. So we decided to stay at a hotel called Hotel Pergola, which was a really great decision. The hotel was a little bit outdated in terms of decor, but it was safe, it was clean, and it was well located, which is the most important aspect to look for, in my opinion, just because I never traveled to stay in the hotel, and there's so much to see on the Amalfi Coast that you're not not going to want to stay in your hotel more than you have to. But when you look for your hotel, I think it's really important to understand how the Amalfi Coast looks like. So basically, like the name suggests, it's the coast. So there's the main road that's closer to the sea level, which is close to Positano and Amalfi. And then upwards on the hill, you'll have other towns and other hotels and Airbnbs and things like that. But I think it's really important to find a place to sleep that is on the main road, so not upwards on the hills, just because it's going to be so much more complicated and time consuming to go from one place to the other if you're on the hills, because most buses travel along that main road. So it's really important to double check that, because sometimes on the map it looks really close, but in fact it's going to increase your travel time between your hotel and another town. So our hotel was really perfectly located, because first it was on that main road and it was located between Amalfi and Positano. So it was perfect, because one day we decided to go to Positano and another day we decided to go to Amalfi. So we were always at a reasonable distance from the little towns that we wanted to visit. So I would really recommend making a list of the activities or the towns you want to visit and finding a place to sleep that is located in the middle of all of those activities. So my next point is budgeting and costs. So the Amalfi Coast is quite an expensive place to visit. It's a very touristy place to go, so it's more expensive, but there are also other cities that are a lot more affordable than the Amalfi Coast, such as Naples. So if you really want to go to Italy, but not necessarily the Amalfi Coast, and you're on a budget, I think it's worth exploring other options. But I think it's really possible to visit the Amalfi Coast on a budget. So on our trip, we had a budget of $4,000 each for 2 weeks, but we also visited other cities. So this $4,000 is not just for the Amalfi Coast. And I think what's most expensive is your plane tickets and also your hotel or Airbnb. So these are going to be your most expensive costs. So if you're able to find deals or make little sacrifices on these two aspects, it can really change the total amount of your trip. But once that is paid, I didn't find that the food was really expensive, or at least it was a lot less expensive than what I expected. So for us, the breakfast was included, so that saved a little cost. But I always prefer to stop at the grocery store when I'm on a trip to buy things for breakfast, just because it's less expensive, but also it allows me to start my day more quickly, just because I have my breakfast at the hotel and get out the door and I'm ready to enjoy the day. And also, if you're really on a budget, you can do the same thing for lunch. But I really like to have lunch in a restaurant, and that's what we did on the Amalfi Coast, and it was really worth it because there was a lot of walking, it was really hot, and so just stopping and sitting down and having a nice meal was really nice. But unless you're going to a really chic restaurant, the prices on food at the restaurant are really reasonable in my opinion. Also, an important cost to consider is traveling costs. So once you're on the Amalfi Coast, if you plan on, and I really suggest it, if you plan on going from one town to the other, that's going to cost you something. So you have a few options. You can take the bus, you can take a taxi, you can rent a car, you can rent a scooter. As I've said, taking taxi is really expensive, so it's not something that I would recommend. Just for an example, when we arrived at the Amalfi Coast and we were unable to stop at our bus stop and we had to go all the way to Amalfi, we really didn't want to take another bus because we were of course afraid that the same situation would happen again. So we asked for a taxi and they would have charged us 40 euros just for a 7-minute drive. And I think it's important to know that they're going to charge you for your luggage, so it really didn't make sense. Also, renting a car or some scooters can be an interesting option. It's important to know that people drive really differently on the Amalfi Coast. Personally, I'm really glad we didn't do that. The road on the Amalfi Coast is really tight and there are two ways and it's near the cliff, and sometimes pedestrians walk really close and there isn't always a sidewalk, and sometimes scooter drivers will drive in between cars and there's oftentimes big tourist bus that takes a lot of place on the road. So it can be really difficult and stressful to drive if you're not used to this kind of driving style. So I personally would not have felt safe driving there or being the passenger of someone who isn't used to that as well. But if you feel comfortable doing that, it can be a really interesting option. And I think that I would choose to rent a scooter over a car because it can be just a little bit more easy to manage. Also, it's a little bit unrealistic to walk from one town to the other because they are not so close and there isn't always a sidewalk, and as I've said, the roads can be a little bit challenging. So that leaves the bus, which isn't a perfect solution, but for us it was the most practical way considering everything that I've just mentioned. So the bus is really inexpensive. I think it was below €5 per ticket, but the buses are also really unreliable. It's really not out of the ordinary to wait 45 minutes for the bus. So in some, there's different ways to move around on the Amalfi Coast, and they all have their benefits and their downsides, and they have different costs. So it's all about knowing the different options and what they involve and choosing the one that's right for you. Now, the last element of budgeting that I'm going to address is the activities. So we didn't really spend too much on activities because there's a lot of things to do that are completely free. I think the most interesting thing to do on the Amalfi Coast is just getting to different towns and walking around in those towns. Okay, so as for which town you should visit, now of course I haven't visited every town on the Amalfi Coast, but the ones I did visit I would really recommend because I absolutely love them. So obviously there's Positano and Amalfi. These are the two most touristy, most popular places to go for a reason. So of course if you're on the Amalfi Coast, you should definitely stop by Positano and Amalfi. You don't really need to stay there as I've mentioned because it's really expensive, and I think you have enough of one day to see everything that there's to see in these towns. Another really interesting town to go to is Ravello. So this is a more low-key town. It's not the most popular place to go, but it's definitely one of my favorite. Contrary to Amalfi and Positano, it's really calm. There isn't too much tourists. I remember going there after spending a few days in tourist crowds, and it just felt like breathing again. It's super nice and relaxing, and I would really recommend going there because it's really different from Positano and Amalfi. First, like I've said, because it's less touristy, but also because it's higher on the hills, whereas Positano and Amalfi are more at sea level. So when you're in Ravello, you have different kinds of views, and there's a really nice garden to visit there. If I remember correctly, there's a little fee, but it's really worth it because it's huge. You can walk in there, again, like no crowds, and it's so stunning. And it's called the Villa Simbron. I'm going to write it on the screen just because I'm not sure how you pronounce that, but I would really recommend going there. So of course there are other towns to visit, but these are my top 3: Positano, Amalfi, and Ravello. Okay, so now I thought it would be fun to discuss a little bit what kind of activities there's to do and which one I recommend or not. So first, of course, there's the beach. Now, something that's really important to know and that we didn't know in advance and we were quite surprised is that on the Amalfi Coast, most of the time, especially in really popular towns such as Positano and Amalfi, you have to pay to access the beach. And how it works is that you rent a chair for the day, and it can cost from like €25 to over €50, and on the same beach there can be different prices. In my opinion, it's not necessarily worth it to rent the most expensive chair because it's the same beach and there isn't much of a difference. And also usually renting a chair for the day is a little bit less expensive in Amalfi than in Positano, and they're probably even less expensive in less popular towns. So going to the beach is a must do, I think, especially if you have a really packed schedule. It can be really nice to have a day where you just relax by the beach, but definitely make sure you look at the different prices. Also, another activity that I really suggest doing is hiking the Path of Gods. So if you're in shape and you want a more active activity, I would really recommend doing that because the views are stunning. You have the most breathtaking views there, and there are different places where you can start or finish the trail. So definitely get informed on that. We started our trail in Bomadero, so we took a bus to that town. And if you're doing the same, I would really suggest making sure you're on the right trail before starting. It's not really well indicated, so we started walking in a completely different direction, and like 1 hour in we realized that we weren't even on the Path of Gods, and so we had to walk back another hour. When we finally were able to start the Path of Gods, we were already kind of exhausted. So don't make the same mistake as us and make sure you're actually going in the right direction to avoid confusion and walking for hours and hours and hours. Also, if you're starting the trail in Bomadero, it's important to know that this town is a little bit like in Ravello, where it's higher up on the coast, and you'll finish also higher up in the hills. So not really in Positano, because Positano is more at sea level. So once you're done with the hike, you have a lot of stairs to go down before you're in Positano. So save some energy, because once you think the trail is done, it's not really done. Another activity that we did, but this time I wouldn't really recommend it, is the grotta dello smeraldo. And it's not that there's anything wrong with this activity. If you have time to do it, you can absolutely do it. It's fun. But it just wasn't my favorite activity. And basically what you're going to do is get into a little boat and go around a little cave. Another idea of activity is doing a limoncello tasting tour. We didn't have time to do that, so if I had to do it over again, I wouldn't do the grotta dello smeraldo and I would do that instead. So when you're planning your trip, I think it's something worth researching. Finally, the last activity that I want to discuss is renting a private boat. And that is something that we did that I really didn't expect us to actually do. But we had planned a budget for our whole trip. And towards the end of our trip, we realized that we were definitely a lot under our budget. And so we decided to get some information on how much it would cost to rent a boat. And we realized that we could totally afford it without busting our budget. And it ended up being one of my favorite things that we did on this whole trip. So to rent a private boat, we went to Amalfi, and they informed us that if we rent the boat the same day, it would be a lot cheaper. So that's what we did. In the end, it cost us like around $300 to $350, I think. I'm not sure if it's in euros or in Canadian dollars, but regardless, it was a lot less expensive than what we thought. At that price, we were willing to do it, so we reserved it for the same day. And that's my biggest tip. If you really want to rent a private boat, it's worth going there at the beginning of your trip and ask someone local that's near the beach. You'll see there's some stands and ask for the price. And oftentimes, they're going to give you a crazy price like $600, or they might offer you to go on the boat the same day if they have availabilities. And if you do that, then they're going to be willing to negotiate the price more because they haven't been able to rent it so far, so they rather rent it to you for $300 than having no reservation for the day. In other words, if you want to get a better deal, you should rent it for the same day. And that's why I recommend doing that earlier in your trip, because then you have more days to go there, ask if they have any availabilities, and have the chance to rent it the same day and get a better deal. So another really important question is, when is the best time to go to the Amalfi Coast? In my experience, I went there in late June, early July, and it's probably not the best time to go there actually, because it's really warm, which I don't really mind. I actually like warm weather, but for a lot of people that might be an issue. And also it's the peak season of tourists, so you have to expect that places like Amalfi, Positano are going to be extremely crowded. But if that's your only time you can go there, it's still really worth it. It's still going to be an amazing trip. But if you have the luxury to be able to choose whenever you want to travel, I think the best months to go to the Amalfi Coast is May or September. So you're just before or just after the peak season of traveling. So you'll have less tourists, and also you'll still have nice weather, but it's going to be a lot less hot than in June or July. Now, the last thing that's important to consider is how you're going to get back home. So if you're ending your trip on the Amalfi Coast and you have to go back to the airport, I would suggest, if you're staying at a hotel, to ask the reception if they are able to book you a shuttle. So for us, it was so much easier to take a shuttle from our hotel back to the Naples airport than what we originally had planned. Thankfully, our hotel shared this suggestion that we just take the shuttle, and most hotels will offer a similar service at a really reasonable price, and I really think it's worth asking about that, and I would suggest doing that a few days earlier so you're sure to have a place. So anyways, that completes everything that I wanted to discuss on this video. I've shared everything that I've learned on this trip and my favorite tips. So if you have any other questions, please leave me a little comment. And if you like the video, don't forget to give it a thumbs up and subscribe to my channel.